Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which and lands on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the overrepresentation of First Nations peoples in our prisons and recognise the ongoing legacy that colonisation and dispossession has on Aboriginal people and on their criminalisation and on their lives generally. We have a wonderful panel here today. Thank you so much for being here and giving us your time again. We've had a number of questions via the website from members of the public. We also had a number of comments made by people who have experienced solitary confinement. We can't follow up with those people, but we invite them to contact us directly if they would like to share their stories. We might be able to help them do that if that's what they would like to do. So let's start perhaps by just asking each of you to describe why you think solitary confinement is so damaging for prisoners. So Terry, perhaps you'd like to start?
All right. Well, I'm a psychiatrist, so I have been studying human behavior and human relations, social relations for my entire adult life. Human beings are social animals. We get our sense of meaning by being with each other. We get a sense of reality by testing our ideas with other people who we talk to. And it's just part of who we are. If you deprive people of social connection, and I mean meaningful connection, I don't mean an officer coming by and passing a food tray through a slot in the door. I'm talking about actually talking with people, feeling cared for, feeling that someone's listening. If you take that away, and by the way, at the same time, there's almost total idleness in solitary. There's nothing productive to do. And human beings are also productive animals, and we get our sense of stability from doing things in the world and accomplishing things and being with each other. If you take all of that away, people fall apart. The damage in solitary confinement is immense and very long lasting. And that's why I think it should not be allowed at all.
Thank you. Nalini, would you like to comment?
Sure. My name is Nalini Nadkarni. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Utah. And I came into the world of corrections from a sort of a different pathway, I guess, than many people in criminal justice and the legal aspects. And that was through the strong connection that humans have for nature. And I think just as Terry has said, we have a strong need for social interactions. My own research and the research of many other biologists and psychologists have shown that we have a very strong connection to nature. And when that is denied to us as humans, there are negative consequences in terms of behavior, emotional status, and just being as a human being. So my approach as an ecologist, as someone who seeks to understand nature from an ecological standpoint, and in particular trees and forests, I made efforts starting about 15 years ago to bring lectures and conservation projects to the incarcerated, starting with adult males, also including women, and just in the last 3 years, including youth who are in custody. And we enlisted scientists and conservationists to do lectures and conservation projects that the incarcerated people themselves could get involved with and have a sense of contribution, as again, as Terry said, was very important, that they were contributing not only to their own lives and learning skills, but also to reducing the possibility of extinction of the rare and endangered species that they were actually working to grow and to nurture and to bring to life, literally. And we worked on that for about, I guess, 10 years or so when I realized that I was actually missing the portion of the incarcerated population that perhaps needed this the most. And those were the men and women who are held in solitary confinement and secured housing. And so I began making efforts to penetrate that part of the prison system in Oregon and in Washington State and in Utah. But we couldn't bring lecturers or plants or animals or soils into those cell blocks. And so drawing from the literature on the effects of being able to see nature imagery by patients in hospitals and the ameliorative effect that just viewing nature imagery has on recovery, physical recovery and emotional recovery of people in hospitals, we simply extended that to this men and women who are confined in solitary confinement cell blocks. And we were able to find some very positive responses, which I can go into later. but it really reinforced this idea that when we deny people access to any shred of nature, any possible contact with nature, we are creating situations that are only making the situation worse, and in fact could be bettered by fairly simple interventions of either nature or nature imagery. So that's where my group is sort of coming from.
Thank you. Debbie, would you like to comment?
Before I speak this morning, I want to acknowledge that I'm an occupier on unceded Meanjin land here in otherwise known Brisbane in Australia. And I want to acknowledge elders past and present and show my respects to them. You know, when we walk into our prisons here in any part of this country, we see the ongoing colonising project of First Nations people, where they're criminalised and pipelined into state-sanctioned carceral mechanisms, from the so-called child protection system through to the youth prison, through to the adult prison. As someone who's experienced more than 20 years of imprisonment as a child and as an adult, and also the experience of solitary confinement for months and months on end as a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old child, I know the effects of that, not only to myself, but when I speak to women now, and I was speaking to a family member just yesterday of a young woman, well, she's in her 30s now, but, you know, I've known her since she's about 12, Aboriginal woman, and has bad drug addiction due to sexual abuse and physical violence growing up, and, you know, in her adult life, she's now been incarcerated. And what we're seeing is she, as well as other women and people, being put in our prisons during this COVID-19 directly into solitary confinement. And we're seeing even more effects, how it's affecting people being, you know, who haven't been in prison, but go directly from out in the free world into solitary confinement for 14 days to so-called self-isolate, even though they have no decision about that themselves, and they're locked down and dealing with the, you know, the withdrawals of heavy drug addictions as well, and can't have any human contact. So we see people's minds breaking down, you know, disintegrating a lot quicker than before. So yeah, thanks for allowing me to participate, and look forward to the conversation.
Helen, would you like to say something?
I also wish to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the land and seas on which I'm on, and pay my elders to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. For me, I started working at PLS about 8 years ago, and it had been suggested to me at the beginning of my employment that the maximum security units was an area where there were really terrible things happening, and I needed to try and go into those units and see what was going on to help people. And that's where people are held in prolonged solitary confinement in Queensland. And so I did that in my first month of working at PLS, and I was so shocked by what I saw. And I initially was going in there every 6 weeks, and it became impossible to do that because it was actually so traumatic, seeing the effects of solitary confinement on people. But I guess since that time, I've worked with lots of people in solitary confinement, and I've seen it destroy them. I've seen it kill them. I've seen it irreversibly damage them. So, and I've also seen people come straight out of solitary into the community and commit crimes straight away. So even if you don't care about the impacts that solitary confinement has on the human beings that are experiencing it, it's not a practice that promotes community safety. So my view is it's a medieval practice that has stayed in our system for many years because we haven't thought of what else we can do. And that's why it's so important that we talk about what the alternatives are.
Mm. And that leads really well into one of the questions. We had a number of questions come through about why people are in solitary confinement in the first place. So one person asked, is it true that prisoners are often placed in solitary confinement for their own safety? Would anyone like to comment on that? Debbie, would you like to comment on that?
I think that's what the prison industry uses, that type of language, to lock us up in solitary confinement for our own safety. Where the reality is, it actually makes us more it makes us unsafe. And it's a way that the carceral state controls us and tries to batter us down, if you like, especially if you're a person who's outspoken. They will try to break your spirit, and that's one way that they'll use solitary confinement. It's also a way to control behaviour of people who are unwell. So people with an intellectual disability, people with a cognitive disability, mental health issues, whether on the lower end of the spectrum to the higher end of the spectrum, they'll use solitary confinement in whatever form. And I know that here in this jurisdiction, they don't use the language solitary confinement, but we know that it is. They use other, fluffy window dressed language to cover up the reality of it. So they will keep those women, and I'll speak about women, locked down for periods of time. And, like I can think of one of the women that I know that's been basically locked down on and off for over a 3-year period. And, she has mental health issues, she has an intellectual disability, even to the point where we've got expert reports to give to courts and corrections to explain to them that she needs to be dealt with in a more humane way, show respect and dignity, because she keeps getting charged with criminal offences also whilst in prison. So she's now in prison. She continues to stay in prison for the offences that she so-called commits while she's inside, which is where it's her resistance to the violence that is actually being perpetrated against her. So, for example, prison officers will stir her up to get a response. Or for her to have some human contact, she will grab the food or the cup and throw it and smash it, a plastic cup. So then she's charged with willful damage. And, 6 prison officers will come in the cell, hold her down, cut her clothes off, body shackle her and put a spit hood on her. But that's the only human contact that she has, and that's why she does that. Where myself or others, from my law firm go and see her, because we treat her with respect and dignity and give her that care as another human being. She's never been violent to any of us, or any of Sisters Inside staff, for example. It's only been the prison staff who actually come in and brutalise her, and it's a way, 1, for human contact, 2, to defend herself.
I met a young man several years ago who he suffered from schizophrenia. He was very naive. He comes into the prison and he's immediately raped by another tougher guy who's in a gang. And they put him in solitary confinement as protective custody. He was 2 cells away from the gang member who had raped him, and the tier tender, the volunteer prisoner who walked up and down the tier, was a member of the same gang. So he was actually traumatized and persecuted worse in solitary confinement than he was on the prison yard. So that should never happen. There are many uses of solitary confinement. An absolutely incorrect use and very harmful use right now with COVID-19 is that people are being locked in solitary supposedly for their own good as a contagion control. That is absolutely not okay. If you think about it, I write a lot about the horrors of solitary confinement. I talk to hundreds and hundreds of prisoners who are in solitary, and I list their symptoms that they tell me about. Anxiety and panic attacks are the #1 symptom that happens immediately in solitary. Now, what are we all feeling about the COVID-19 pandemic? We all feel massive anxiety. Why would we think prisoners don't feel massive anxiety with the pandemic? So you put someone who's feeling massive anxiety in solitary confinement, which causes and exacerbates massive anxiety. And what happens? They have one form of mental breakdown or another. In California, solitary confinement is used for gang control. And gang control is a bizarre procedure because the officials don't really know who's in a gang. So if they see 2 Latin American men giving each other a high five, and one of them they suspect of being in a gang, they then say the other one's in a gang. And they put people in gangs into solitary confinement. They're called SHUs in California, security housing units, forever. It's an indeterminate sentence. A few years ago, we won a big case, Ashker versus Governor of California, prohibiting placement of people in solitary merely for supposed, it's alleged, never proven, gang affiliation. In most situations, it's used to punish bad behavior, but they're not crimes. The crimes that people commit get them sentenced to prison. That's their sentence. Solitary confinement is not anybody's sentence. Rarely does a judge say, I'm sending you to prison for 20 years and you're going to spend it in solitary. We have a few people like that, and it's absolutely a human rights abuse and torture that the judge has assigned that. But mostly solitary is a punishment inside the prison for in-prison behaviors. If the behaviors are severe enough, for instance, a murder, the person is going to be taken to court and tried and given a longer sentence. There's no penological objective in solitary confinement. It's merely a way to break people down and damage them. There are all kinds of other reasons. In women's prisons, sexual abuse is perpetrated mainly by male staff. And if a woman complains, first of all, very few women complain because they're going to be in worse trouble when they complain. One of the things that's going to happen is they're going to be put in solitary for their own protection. So what happens is women don't complain. And the sexual abuse is just rife in the prisons because of that. The threat of being placed in solitary keeps people from standing up for their rights. I could go on. There are many other reasons to use solitary.
Helen, would you like to comment?
Well, I mean, particularly what Terry was just saying, I have spoken to women who've said to me, I would rather be raped than be in solitary confinement. And that's why they don't come forward about certain things that have happened to them in prison, because they know that they will be placed into solitary for those protective purposes. So that comment has always stayed with me, because it, you know, nobody should have to make a decision about which of those two things they're going to experience in prison. But when they say that they would rather be raped than be placed in solitary confinement, it really shows just how damaging and traumatic solitary confinement is. In terms of my experience, I've worked with people who've been placed in solitary confinement who have committed every possible crime under the sun, from very low level crime that's resulted in them going into jail to really serious crime. But, you know, it's as Terry said, it's to do with what's happened in jail. Although I have seen cases where a person has been placed into solitary on admission to jail because of concerns that they may be at risk of self-harm. So because of their history and because of the jail's need to make sure there isn't a death in custody, they manage self-harm issues by placing people into solitary where they can be observed more readily. So there's the three key reasons. The three key reasons in Queensland are to stop you from suiciding effectively, to monitor you if you're a self-harm risk, to protect you from others if you're an informant or if you're unsafe, or because you've done something in jail that means you might be a risk to others. But as Terry said, it's nothing to do with the crime that you came into jail for. It's to do with what's happening in the jail. And also when Deb was talking before about people committing crime or so-called crime when they're in solitary, I see that all the time. People, when they're in solitary, become so unwell or so desperate for human contact that they will do things that are crimes, and they will then get trapped in this cycle where they can't get out of solitary because they keep engaging in behaviours that are problematic from a prison management perspective and that are crimes. And so they keep getting new offences because of how unwell they've become in solitary and the things they need to do to survive.
Nalini, would you like to add anything?
Sure, just a tiny piece, which is, as I said, I'm someone who's come into the world of mass incarceration from the side of ecology and biology. I learned that they weren't these hardened criminals, as you said, Terry, that were sentenced to these, you know, that they were the worst of the worst, as we always hear as described as solitary confinement inmates, but rather that they got there because of some behavior that the prison officers didn't want to see. And so I think one of the really important things that your group might be able to do is to educate people who aren't in the world of mass incarceration and let people know that the men and women in solitary confinement are not the worst of the worst. They're not the psychotic. I mean, there may be some of those that are in there or get to that stage, but what I learned was that, you know, we on the outside are so ignorant of why people are in solitary confinement. And from when people hear I work in solitary confinement now, they say, oh my God, why are you working with the worst of the worst and those psychotic people who should never be let out? That isn't the case. And I'm constantly having to educate other people who don't know about this system, about who is living in or who is being kept in those cells. So I think that would be a really important priority to help everybody understand the whys and wherefores of why those particular individuals have ended up in those terrible places.
So what are some of the alternatives then, with so much preoccupation in our questions about aren't people there for their protection? Aren't people there because they've committed terrible crimes? It seems from the questions that we receive that there is this perception that people who are in solitary confinement need to be there for some reason. So I wonder if we could talk a bit about what we think could be done instead, what reasonable and action could be taken that promotes the well-being of prisoners and protects the community. Debbie, would you like to start?
I just want to add to the tail end of the last question, when we talk about that solitary something that happens internally, like you're not sentenced. Like, so you're sentenced to a term of imprisonment or you're remanded in custody awaiting your matters to be dealt with in court. And here we have nearly 40% of our prison population on remand who are fundamentally innocent till proven guilty. And so, and we can't forget that in the last decade that we had laws here in this state, which we called bikie laws, where if you were deemed labelled a bikie and you went into custody, you actually went directly to solitary confinement. So it was actually legislated. So it's not necessarily only about what happens on the inside for so-called prison management. And we know that from that, there's a series of 3 cases, X, Y, and Z, we call them, in the Supreme Court now, that from those days of the so-called bikie laws, where if you spend 1 day in solitary confinement, it's now equal to 7 days mainstream. So it can be used in individuals' matters before the court if they're held in solitary confinement, which can now be used because we have another situation from the chief medical officer because of COVID, that if you come into prison, you go 14 days into solitary confinement. And so we as lawyers must use those cases in courts for those that are being held in solitary confinement now for the 14 days. Some were being held a lot longer if they were in one prison in solitary for 14 days and then moved to another, and they would have to do another 14 days. That's now ceased under the Chief Medical Officer's directions. However, we still have 14 days. Alternatives. Well, as a prison abolitionist, we've got to look at decarceration strategies. We know that, people say, well, what about the rapists and murderers? And when people say that to me, it's a clear indication that they actually don't know who's in our prisons. We have the most marginalised people in our community that are in prison. The mass incarceration of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. People who live in absolute poverty, people who are homeless, people with mental illness, people with drug addictions. And this is because social services have been eviscerated over decades by, ongoing governments. Doesn't matter who they are, left or right or centre or whatever you want to call them. But that's what we have. I think at the moment what we have, though, is an opportunity where people are seeing, or probably more so experiencing first, the failure of capitalism. This virus comes out of capitalism, where we've seen private health, everything's being privatised, and under privatisation they decide, well, we only need 1 ventilator, for example, we don't need 30, but now we have this virus that's, travelling around the world via people, and we do need many more ventilators. We're seeing how governments are propping up, for example, childcare. We're seeing that the workers that capitalism have been trying to get rid of are the workers that we are relying on to survive. And so we need to push governments now to do more. We see in some jurisdictions here that they've changed laws to be able to release people, that fall in the vulnerable group, in regards to COVID, even though they haven't done that. However, the laws are there, but we're seeing in other jurisdictions, other countries, mass releases, tens and tens of thousands of people in Iran. We see all around the world. In the US, some governors are releasing more than others, and it goes on. And so that's a clear indication, I think, that the community is seeing that if you can release people en masse by those numbers, they're obviously not dangerous people. And we know that, so this jurisdiction, the top 10 offences for women that are in prison are things like, breaches of bail conditions, low-level drug offences, like possession of low-level drug offences that don't even go to our Supreme Court. They're dealt with in, the lower courts. Stealing, which is usually food. Breaches of domestic violence orders because they've defended themselves, but the police have put the orders on the woman, and when she defends herself again, she's actually criminalised and then in prison. So women who are in prison here are for very low-level offences that can be supported in the community and released very quickly. Well, I would say don't even criminalise and put them in the first instance because we need the social services. So in regards to solitary confinement, if someone, we need to abolish any form of solitary confinement. If corrective services in whatever jurisdiction wants to put someone in any form of solitary confinement, I believe they need to go to the Supreme Court and argue that case for an order that occurs. At least there's judicial oversight about what is happening to that person, and then have reviews every 2 days in the Supreme Court about that person and what's happening, because we know that people decompensate within 48 hours in solitary confinement, and then even the UN says after 48 hours, it's torture. So we need judicial oversight. The time has come that corrective services must be held accountable instead of hiding behind big concrete walls, razor-wide walls, and to do what they want, when they want, how they want, to who they want. There must be judicial oversight. And they will say, well, we don't have the time to do that. Well, you've got the time to write reports and all the rest of it. There's no you have to do that anyway to put someone in solitary. So actually there's no other issue about using Crown law to a Supreme Court to make the same argument. If they're so clear and they're so convinced that this is the absolute right decision, present it to a Supreme Court justice.
No one else like to comment?
I would like to add a word to what Debbie just said, which was absolutely spot on, and that's the word disappear. If you take the population in society that has serious mental illness, public mental health services are just deficient. We have reneged on our responsibility to offer care and wraparound services, for instance, housing and vocational assistance. And people with mental illness are disappeared into the prisons. It's part of the mass incarceration. It's only a small part of it, but then they tend to make up a significant proportion of prisoners. What's happening is that ordinary citizens out in society are saying, I don't want to see people who are being ignored by our society, for instance, a homeless, drug-addicted, mentally ill person. And so the state says, okay, we'll put them behind bars. Then there's lock them up and throw away the key. And that's a situation which, in terms of sociological dynamics, just brings on abuse. So officers have total secrecy to do what they want with the people who have been disappeared from society. So guess what? Those with mental illness are hugely disproportionately sent to solitary confinement. I mean, think about it. The staff doesn't know what to do with them. So when you say, what are the alternatives? First of all, we have to consider the fact that the problem is iatrogenic. The reason people are difficult to manage who are in solitary confinement is not because they're particularly negative or difficult people. It's because they've been damaged by solitary confinement, imprisonment first, and then solitary confinement. We need to take them out. We need to never put them there in the first place. But for the people who are in there, the significant proportion with mental illness need quality mental health care, including rehabilitation, vocational training, workshops where they can do something productive. If you take people who get angry easily and give them something meaningful to do, for instance, that will help them prepare to have a trade when they get out of prison, they're not going to act out. It's very rare that someone who you speak to respectfully and you say, I'm going to train you to make cabinets. You just come into the cabinet shop every morning at 8 o'clock, and I'll teach you how to use the tools. That person's never going to get into disciplinary problems. So the alternative to solitary is programs that helps people rehabilitate. That's what the prisons are supposed to be about. Those rehabilitation programs in the prisons, just like public mental health services in the community, are non-existent. There aren't rehabilitation programs. So the people are in crowded facilities, and again, following Debbie, they're crowded because of mass incarceration. People are being sent to prison for every sort of behavior for longer and longer periods. The prisons are very over capacity, and we know from social science that crowding causes an increase in violence, mental breakdown, and suicide. So you put people in there, crowd them together, people get angry, they hit each other, you throw a bunch of them in solitary. Solitary makes them more angry, more likely to hit somebody, and the whole situation is circular. I just want to add one comment about, I could say more about this, but I'll stop for the moment, but about suicide. Solitary confinement causes suicide. And the research I have to support that idea is that 50% of successful suicides in prison, and there's a lot more suicides in prison on average than in the population at large, 50% of prison suicides occur among the population in solitary confinement. And the observation cells they're put in, if there's serious observation, I've been in many prisons where the officers don't even look into the cell and don't talk to the people in observation. But if there is serious observation, then the suicide will be prevented until they get out of the observation cell. Typically, they're then sent back to a solitary confinement cell where they kill themselves. So the statistic that 50% of successful suicides occur in people who are in solitary confinement is convincing evidence that solitary causes suicide. There's absolutely no reason it should be prohibited to put people who are at all suicidal in solitary confinement.
Actually, one question we had concerned observation cells, and the person asked, is there a legal reason why we have to keep the lights on all the time?
And I think the reason in Queensland is to do with observations. And I think, so if somebody's at risk of self-harm, they need to be able to be observed all the time, because if they're going to self-harm in the dead of the night, when the lights are all off, nobody can see that. So that's my understanding of why the lights are on. But I think also when we're talking about alternatives, firstly, I agree with the whole concept that solitary needs to go. Solitary has to go. And I agree with what Deb was saying as well about the whole system is propped up by a whole range of problems. But when you're in the reality of the situation that we've got all these people who are in solitary right now, the practical question is, well, what do we do with these people right now? What do we do tomorrow with these people right now? And, you know, I think prison administrators' perspective would be, this person's really dangerous. What do I do with this really dangerous person? And I think when you're talking about alternatives, you have to look at the purpose of solitary. What is your purpose of putting these people into this environment? And the purpose is different depending on, you know, those three factors again: self-harm, protection, or risk to others. And your alternatives have to be aimed at achieving those purposes in different ways. So if your purpose for putting somebody in solitary is because you're trying to stop them from self-harming and suiciding, the irony is exactly what Terry has just been saying, is it doesn't work. It's not an effective way of achieving that. So there are other effective ways, like therapeutic housing units. There's hospitals. You know, what's done with people in hospitals who are self-harming and at risk of self-harm. Solitary confinement is not the only way to deal with self-harming. Secondly, you've got people who are at risk of harm from others. So what's the alternative to that? Well, finding them a place where they're not at risk from others. not keeping them in a cell for a prolonged period of time. And I've had situations where if they've said, oh, but this person needs to stay in this prison because their court matters are being dealt with in this prison. So, but they're not safe in this prison. So they have to stay in solitary while we wait for the court matters to be dealt with. Well, if COVID's shown us anything, it's flexibility. You know, you can transfer somebody to another jail and have them linked up by video link. But at the core of all of it has to be the understanding that solitary confinement is so harmful that we have to find another way to deal with those problems. And there are other ways. They may be slightly less convenient because the practice is so entrenched and it's just so easy for administrators to put people into solitary confinement. But when you look at the long-term effects and the harm, it is not the most simple and easy solution. And the most serious category, which I think a lot of people think of the majority of people in solitary, but it's not necessarily the case, are the people who do something bad in jail. So they may be really violent to another person in jail. So from the prison administration's perspective, they have to protect other prisoners. They have to protect staff from this very dangerous person. My response to that is putting somebody in solitary confinement who's violent is a time bomb. And every day you leave them in there, you're adding more dynamite to that time bomb. And when it explodes, it's going to hurt somebody. So your options are you can try and mitigate that harm now, or you can put them in a cell and leave them there for years at a time where that time bomb's going to explode and somebody somewhere is going to get hurt. And maybe that somebody is going to be the person in the community standing next to that person at the bus stop when they're released. So by damaging people because they've done something bad, it's not a logical way to stop them from doing bad things. It's not going to achieve that purpose. So when solitary is not achieving the purposes for which you're putting them into that environment, why are you doing it?
Nalini, would you like to comment on this?
I would. I think that some of the work that we've done relates to this question of what do you do at this moment? What is the intervention that you could provide to bring down the level of violence at the moment with that particular individual? And I think what I'm proposing is really just one tool in a toolkit that I think that we could come up with that have, as you said, come up where there are similarly people who are in danger of suicide or self-harm, in danger of violence to others. But the one that is just seemingly very simple and very obvious is to provide exposure to nature, because nature does have a calming effect. It reduces stress, it reduces anxiety. There are hundreds and hundreds of studies that now demonstrate when people take a walk through the park, when we look at their brains and what part of their brains are excited when they encounter nature, that stress levels go down, that salivary cortisol levels go down, that galvanic skin responses can be shown to be reduced when exposed to nature or nature imagery. And just to give you the details of our own study, this was at one supermax prison in one cell block that was divided in half. We had a projector that we installed in the exercise room of one exercise room where the men go in routinely. We didn't want to disrupt the normal routine so that it wouldn't be, the intervention wouldn't be seen as disruptive to what the normal daily patterns were. And so the men were allowed to watch and choose one of 38 nature videos that we provided during their exercise time. They almost uniformly always chose to watch a video rather than not watch one. And they were able to choose which one they wanted. This went on for a year. And the other side of the cell block, which had prisoners of similar risk, similar age and mental condition, had an exercise room that they went to that we didn't show them videos. So after a year of showing them videos, we gave the inmates a survey about their emotional responses, how they felt after they watched these videos. They almost uniformly said that they felt calmer, they felt less angry, they felt less anxious, and they could carry those emotions back to their single cells when they went back to their own cell. We gave surveys also to the staff who corroborated this. In fact, the staff began using what we call the blue room. They had painted the walls of that exercise room in the cell block B, the one where they saw videos, a light blue because they knew that had a calming effect. And the officers would say when they would start observing one of the inmates acting up or being anxious or pacing or cursing, they would offer them, that inmate, more time in the blue room. Would you like an extra hour in the blue room? And they found, the officers found, even those who were not receptive to this idea that nature imagery could do anything, found that in fact that was a successful intervention. And perhaps the result that was most important for the prison administrators were that when we compared the violent infractions of those inmates who were watching the videos versus those that didn't, the men who watched the videos committed 26% fewer violent infractions and had fewer disciplinary referrals. So it seemed that this was a practice that was inexpensive, that was easy to install, that was voluntary still on the part of the incarcerated people, that did serve at least in some sort of short-term way to bring down incidents of violence. So obviously this is not the answer to all of the problems of mass incarceration or of solitary confinement, but it might be, but access to nature might be an overlooked intervention, either at the nature imagery level with these severely nature deficient people, or some of the other work that we've done with actually hands-on. Men and women are growing plants, are raising endangered frogs, are raising endangered butterflies, are contributing to something bigger than themselves, bigger than the prison, as big as planet Earth. And that desire to contribute, as you said, Terry, I think, is really one of the most therapeutic aspects of the work that we've been finding in terms of why these men volunteer for the few positions that are available for conservation work. It's this, I want to do something that's good. I want to, even though I'm incarcerated, even though everyone tells me I'm a bad dad and I'm a bad person, I've done something good because I helped raise these frogs that are now going to be out and stop the species from going extinct. So I would invite you guys to think about the ways that access to nature at different levels, depending on the access that the constraints of access are in different levels of incarceration in these prisons, how nature might be one of the best tools that we do have in the toolbox to work at the short and the long term, psychologically, emotionally, and in a very real way, spiritually, in terms of connecting people who are incarcerated with the outside, who are connected from helplessness and uselessness to something that's being helpful and useful.
Yeah, I was surprised that quite unprompted in our research, the disconnect from nature, simple things like being able to stand on grass, being in fresh air, came up an awful lot in our study. And as I say, that was completely unprompted. So it was something that definitely, it was a theme that came through in our work.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing to that? Sorry, Tamara. I think we've actually seen that in another way, in another morph with the COVID. I don't know how it is in Australia, but I know in my neighborhood and in my country, the isolation, the having to bar ourselves inside our homes has really manifested itself in more people gardening, more people taking walks, more people bird watching, more people connecting with nature in ways that they never did when they weren't confined to their own homes. So I think it's just the same spirit that we're talking about, which is isolation can be overcome to some extent when there is a connection to nature.
You know, we haven't really talked about specific comprehensive programs. There are many that work. Actually, it's not difficult to get people out of solitary. First, talk to them. Mm-hmm. Nobody talks respectfully to prisoners, even the prisoners who aren't in solitary. The officers kind of insult them and yell at them and, you know, punish them for breaking rules. But there's very little programming going on in the prisons and none in solitary. So the first thing to help people get out of solitary is go talk to them. We have several states in the United States, Washington, Oregon is coming along quickly, Colorado, where they're barring solitary confinement. They just don't use it. And then the staff say, well, what are we supposed to do with the bad apples among the prisoners? And a good warden will say, well, that's what I'd like you to generate some ideas about. I'm telling you, you can't use solitary. Now you tell me what you're going to do. And the truth is, it takes more intensive staff involvement with troublesome prisoners. Staff have to talk to them. They have to assess them. They have to start, first of all, respecting them, but second of all, fulfilling some of their needs. In Washington and Colorado, there's a two-step program. One is you set up programs. mental health programs, substance abuse programs, training programs, anger management programs, lots of programs. Then you assess the prisoners in solitary. What are they lacking that leads to their getting into the kind of trouble they get into, and put them in the program that deals with that need. And when you do that, just the process of talking with them in a respectful way diminishes their anger and their assaultiveness. I did this in one state where I was involved in class action lawsuit. It was in Mississippi in Unit 32, which was their supermax, 1,000 people. And we challenged the ACLU's prison project, challenged them that this was unconstitutional, and we wanted to look at why everybody was in solitary. And of the 1,000 people, 800 could be released because they were wrongly put in solitary according to the state's own needs. They then built step-down units where mental health professionals, anger management people, substance abuse programs occurred. And the fear was, if you let people out of solitary, then there's going to be more violence and bad behavior in the prisons. The opposite happened. Actually, the violence rate in the entire prison system went way down when they released the 800 from solitary, and the disciplinary write-ups went way down. So in fact, the presence of the supermax prison among the prison population was causing an increase in violence and disciplinary problems. And that's the system that's being put in place all around the United States now, where there's an enlightened administration and government. And New Jersey just passed a law that nobody can be in solitary more than 20 days. I'd like it to be a lot shorter than that and a lot more rare, but that's still a step forward. They're not having increased violence.
We've talked about why the prison puts people in prison, and it's usually about dangerousness, you know, like they're a danger to themselves or to others. And when everyone was talking, I was thinking about Ashley Smith in Canada, who during her coronial inquest, she was a young woman that threw crabtree apples at the post office postie and had an order, breached the order, anyway, then ended up in the system. But because her mental health was deteriorating, she was put in solitary confinement for the whole time, and she was flown across the country and at numerous times. And you know, my good friend and colleague Kim Pate, who was running the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry's Society then, was part of the coronial inquest, because in the end, she would do whatever she could to have any type of human contact. And at the very end, she had ligatures around her neck, and prison officers were going to go in the cell because this was the only way that she could have contact. If she did that, they would come in and take them off her. But they were on the phone to the powers above, right, the prison administration, whatever you want to call them, saying, do not go in that cell until she turns blue. So by the time she's turned blue, she was dead. Now, every prison officer that gave evidence and was cross-examined during that coronial inquest was asked by the lawyers, obviously not corrective services lawyers, but basically, and no, I'm paraphrasing all of this, you know, how was Ashley with you? Oh, Ashley was great with me, you know, like we had conversations, she was no issues. So she was violent? No, she was never violent. You know, Kim was saying as she sat in that inquest that she thought, okay, that's one officer, must have dealt with her in a different way, you know, showed her respect and it was fine. But prison officer after prison officer after prison officer said the same thing. But everything that was written about her in her file was that she was dangerous. And she actually wasn't dangerous. She wasn't violent. But because they read the file and then they take that on board, and then that's how they react and interact with that person in solitary confinement. So that's what I want to say. We must abolish solitary confinement, and we must have or judicial oversight, someone independent that can look at these files that are written by corrective services staff, because a new person comes on and they just keep adding on that she's violent. No one ever actually really writes, well, no, I didn't have that experience. You know, you never see any of the positives. And so that's why we've got to have the judicial oversight. And we really have to question, when corrective services, the prison says someone is dangerous, I actually don't believe them. I really don't. Like, I will go into prison, they will bring women into me in body belts and shackles, and I would tell the prison officers, take the shackles off them now. And they're like, no, we can't. And I demand that they get taken off. And it's only that prison officers who know me that are around will say, it's just Kilroy, take them off. And they will take them off, and there's never an issue. So it is about how you actually treat another human being. Like, it's really basic. If I treat you with respect and dignity, you're going to treat me with respect and dignity, no matter what happens. Even to the point, if the person can't communicate well, I can still communicate with them on a level that I'm showing respect and dignity. But that's not what happens in a prison. And that's why prisons don't work.
And Helen, I know your experience is the same.
Absolutely, because I mean, with, you know, people might say, oh, well, Deb's talking about women and women are different, obviously. But I can also say, in my experience working with men, I've had people who have been described to me by staff as, oh no, he's the most antisocial prisoner in the state. You can't talk to him. Oh, you can't go into a room with him. And, you know, it's exactly what Deb said. It's basic, you know, it's things like apologizing for being late. It's things like asking them, I'm so sorry, you know, I was meant to be here 10 minutes ago. Immediately the dynamic changes, because they're like, this person's treating me with respect. They're apologizing for being late. Or, you know, calling them by their first name or asking them what they want to be called by. In Queensland, you know, people get called by their surnames or called the offender, as if that crime has defined them as a person. And it's just really small things like that. You know, I was talking to somebody recently who's been in prolonged solitary confinement for many years, and he said to me, is there anything I can do for you? Because he could see I was really busy and stressed. And he was like, I'm sorry, you're so busy. I'd really like to try and help you. Is there anything I can do for you? I'm like, mate, I don't know what you can do for me, but I'm really grateful that you thought, like, and this is the thing, I have such valuable relationships with my clients who are described to me as if they're the worst people in the world, but actually they treat me with so much respect, and I'm pretty sure they would never do anything to harm me. And it's that really basic thing of you know, I always remember something a client said to me, you treat me like a piece of shit, I'm going to act like a piece of shit. And that there's reasons for that are related to a trauma background that, you know, need to be explored with that person in a respectful way.
I'm conscious of time, and I actually think that's a really appropriate place to leave it. Unless, one thing I would like to say is that we did invite someone from Queensland Corrective Services to be involved in this panel and in responding to the report, and they declined the invitation. So as I say, I know people have got to go. Is there anything that people would like to finish off with?
I'd like to just share a general principle I work with, and that is people do crimes and they get prison sentences. I'm with Debbie. We have to decarcerate, and prisons are not a solution to any social problem. But there are people who've done bad crimes and they need punishment. Even if we do restorative justice procedures with them, they'll get punished in some way. It'll just be communally determined. And there's a tendency in all of us to seek vengeance. We want to hurt people who have hurt our people somehow. And that's understandable. It's human. It's not a good guide to social policy. And the truth is, when you look at prisons, partly it's punitive. The prison sentence is an attempt to punish. And I think it's too harsh, too long, et cetera, but that's what it's for. And it's for rehabilitation. And I think that it doesn't help us to punish people more and more harshly because they committed a murder or a rape or something like that. The real question for all of us and for society is, does what we do to them in prison make them more or less likely to commit offenses when they get out? And in that regard, solitary confinement is the worst thing you can do to people.
I'd like to say one last thing, and that is, as we strive to, in our interactions with those who are incarcerated, I also feel that very often the staff and administrators and officers are also incarcerated, and that we need to think about them also as people who are, I hate to say this, doing their job, but many of them that I've encountered feel that they are actually performing something useful in society. And it's gotten all twisted up by this power thing and just the insanity of mass incarceration. But I think if we are to think about changing the system of the mass incarceration, we also have to be thoughtful about what are the existing values of the system, and how can what we're trying to do fit in with them. So for example, when we were showing videos to help the men feel better, feel calmer, we also realized that we had more success when we could say, and this may bring down the rates of violence that will make the workplace a safer place for you. And that seemed to ring true, and the officers began to be more helpful. So at every level, whether it's the line officer or the warden or the supervisor or the director of the correction center, if we can make our work be not necessarily confrontative, but how can we together solve this problem? As you pointed out, Terry, there are people who do commit crimes and need somehow to be either punished or kept away or something. We don't know what. The system is not what will do it, but that if we can think about the officers and administrators as people, as well as we do with the inmates, I think that's another really important step to move this work forward.
I think that's really interesting. And I think what needs to happen in Queensland is that the top needs to let the people on the ground know that the culture change is allowed. Because I think there's a culture in prison where the officers behave a particular way, and that culture has to change, and that's going to take a long time. And it needs to start at the top if it's going to trickle down to the bottom. So the changes need to be communicated. This is not, it's not, for example, something very simple: stop calling people in prison offenders. Really simple. Yeah. Just create a policy that says we stop calling these people offenders. Start calling them by whatever's the preferred name, you know, whether it be Mr. This or by their first name. That sort of thing can start changing culture and give the staff on the ground the courage, I suppose, to be able to do that, to make that shift. Because if you're the one on the ground and you're thinking that in your head, but everyone else isn't doing it, you're not going to do it either.
I suppose just listening to everybody else, when we talk about what to do to change things internally into a fundamentally failed prison industrial complex. So someone who's been around the prison system for over 4 decades, in prison and out of prison, but going into prison regularly. I've heard it all before, but you know, the powers that be, we're going to change the culture, we're going to change the culture. The culture is only worse. The culture of prisons is violent. So we, as a community, must develop other models of security for all of us. And prison is not the answer, because prisons are violent. They're fundamentally set up to be violent. So we need to think outside the bars and develop other models of security so that we are all safe. No one, and I don't care what their crime is, needs to be in a violent prison environment. It makes them more violent. We need to think outside the bars and do things differently.
Thank you so much, everyone. We're really, really grateful for your time.